The topic of this segment is the neural and hormonal control of the estrous cycle and the primate menstrual cycle. Basically, you can think of this as a sequence of events that repeats itself over and over again. Part of the cycle deals with the development of the ovum, which has the potential to be fertilized, and the other part of the cycle deals with what's going on in the uterus and how the lining is preparing for the potential implantation of a fertilized ovum. The cycle consists of increases and decreases in the concentrations of a bunch of different hormones. So we're going to use abbreviations some of the time in the diagrams that I'm going to show you. And just to go over some of these so that you're familiar with them, the four hormones that we're mainly going to be following are follicle stimulating hormone, which is abbreviated FSH, estrogen, which is abbreviated with the letter E, luteinizing hormone, abbreviated LH, and progesterone, abbreviated P. So because this is all cyclical, the changes in these hormones rise and fall in a predictable way as long as fertilization hasn't happened. If fertilization does happen, then the sequence of events changes somewhat. So we're going to go over the case in which fertilization does not happen, and so the cycle will repeat itself. First, let's look at what's happening within the follicle. So the follicle is a structure within the ovary. So you can see a cross-section of the ovary here and the cycle that it goes through. And we're going to start right here with the start of the development of the ovum within the ovary. And that happens within a structure that's known as the follicle. And it starts out kind of small, and over a period of several days, it'll increase in size, forming a bubble. So the dark part are cells that surround an empty space that's fluid-filled. And over the course of a few more days, that becomes an even bigger bubble. And you can see part of the cellular tissue here consists of the ovum. So the ovum itself is just one part of the growing structure. The ovum is surrounded by other cells that secrete hormones and is contained within this big bubble. So as the follicle matures, it reaches a point where it bursts and the ovum is released, and you see that happening here. So here's the ovum, and what's left behind is a whole collection of cells that are secreting hormones, and that the hormones that are secreted are going to change over time. Over time also, those cells grow and become much bigger and secrete hormones, and then it becomes known as a corpus luteum. So those are the leftover cells from the follicle. And after a while, they too change in size and structure. They regress, becoming smaller. And eventually, all you see are little tiny remnants of cells, almost like scar tissue, that remain behind. Oops, like right here and right here. So this just repeats itself over and over again over time as long as fertilization hasn't happened. So you have the developing follicles that get bigger, that release the ovum, and then the remaining cells that turn into the corpus luteum and secrete hormones that can maintain pregnancy, shrink over time, and then another follicle will develop and it'll go through the cycle again. Different species have cycles of different lengths. So we're used to thinking about a human cycle, which is about 28 days in length, but this particular example is probably from something like a cow that has a 21-day cycle. All right, so the development of the ovum is under the control of follicle stimulating hormone. So as the name might imply, that's what triggers the follicle to start growing and the cells inside the follicle to start proliferating. It's also under the control of luteinizing hormone. And estrogen is being produced by the cells within the follicle. So we're going to take a look at the concentrations of some of those hormones during the cycle. So this is the part of the cycle that we just looked at with the growth of the follicle and the release of the ovum, and that's called ovulation when that happens. And during this time period, you see FSH being secreted, follicle or luteinizing hormone increasing, and at the same time, estrogen is also increasing. So this is happening as the cells in the follicle are dividing. As there's more of them, they're secreting more estrogen. This is all sort of a positive feedback loop. And it reaches a point at which there's all of a sudden a very abrupt increase in luteinizing hormone. And it's this very abrupt increase in LH that actually causes the follicle to break open and release the ovum for potential fertilization. After ovulation happens, so here's where ovulation happens, the cycle before. After ovulation happens, that's when you get the change in the function of the cells that are left behind in the follicle. And they keep secreting hormone, but instead of secreting estrogen, they're now going to switch over to secreting a large amount of progesterone. And progesterone is the hormone that is largely responsible for increasing and maintaining the thickness of the uterine lining. The uterus is where the fertilized ovum would implant, so that structure has to be ready for implantation when that happens. So the progesterone is very important for getting the uterus ready and for maintaining those very first few days or weeks of pregnancy. If pregnancy doesn't happen, though, then those cells regress, they shrink down, they become smaller, and the corpus luteum basically disappears, and the hormone levels also drop off as a consequence. Once that happens, it can allow a new follicle to develop. So these hormones that previously were low when progesterone was high, like LH, will start to increase in concentration again, causing the follicle to grow and develop and having a new egg ready to be released. So this part of the outline just goes over what I just said, showing on the diagram when it all happens. The one part that I didn't speak a lot about is ovulation itself, and you'll notice that there are two different types of ovulation, or two different categories of mammals that differ in how ovulation happens. Mostly we think of spontaneous ovulation. That means ovulation that happens without any external stimulation. It just all goes on internally. The sequence of events and the changes in hormones happen no matter what kind of social environment or behavioral interactions the female has. That's what humans have. That's what most mammals have. Ovulation happens no matter what the social environment is, whether a female actually mates with a male or not. But there are many species that are what are called induced ovulators. And in those species, ovulation does not happen unless the female mates with a male or has other kinds of sensory stimulation from the male. And mainly what I'm talking about with other sensory stimulation is they encounter chemical substances that are carried in the male's urine. So the way this was shown is with a bunch of rodents, and there's a particular species of rodent called the prairie vole, where females don't ovulate unless they mate with a male or they're around a male. And it's actually even more dependent on social contact than that. The females don't even start any part of their reproductive cycle. They don't even have development of the ovum within the ovary until they have contact with a male. And this happens with a female who just encounters dirty bedding from a male. So if you can take the sawdust that the male has lived on and urinated on, take the male out, put a female in, she'll come into sexual receptivity just by being around those chemicals that are in the male's urine. And she will only ovulate then if she mates with the male. So species vary along that axis. There are some that, like the prairie vole, require a lot of sensory stimulation from the male and behavioral interaction with the male to go through the whole cycle. There are others at the other end of the spectrum that don't require a male to be around at all and will ovulate spontaneously over and over and over again. And then there's some species that are sort of in the middle. So they may be spontaneous ovulators, but the timing of that ovulation may be influenced by the presence of males. And humans are actually in that category. Being around males causes a female's ovulatory cycles to become much more regular and may speed up ovulation. On the other hand, even induced ovulators on occasion may ovulate spontaneously. So it's sort of a flexible system with a lot of variation. The species that are induced ovulators have some behavioral characteristics that go along with induced ovulation that are pretty interesting. So because ovulation needs to be induced by stimulation, male reproductive behavior tends to be very exaggerated. That is, species with induced ovulation tend to mate very, very often and for long durations, and mating tends to be accompanied by a lot of other sensory stimulation. So, for example, if we look at cats or ferrets, a lot of carnivores have induced ovulation, and they can mate many, many times over the course of the female's receptive period, which may only be a few hours or few days. They have multiple matings. There's a lot of biting that goes on, so the male will bite the nape of the neck of the female to add extra sensory stimulation. If you think about the evolution of this from a male's perspective, it's in his interest to do everything he can to ensure that the female ovulates so that his sperm will be fertilizing the ovum. So the males have evolved to really go overboard and really emphasize a lot of sensory stimulation, so the females are more likely to ovulate. Now I'd like to contrast the estrous cycle with the primate menstrual cycle, and even though they have different names, they're actually very, very similar, but not identical. So this is the same kind of diagram as I showed you earlier. Here's what's going on in the ovary. The follicle starts really small, it grows, develops into a bubble. When it gets to be a big bubble, the ovum is released at ovulation, and there are cells left behind that become the corpus luteum, and over time they degenerate. And if you look at what happens with the ebb and flow of hormones, they're pretty similar. You see this growing estrogen as the cells are developing. You see luteinizing hormone have a big spike at the time of ovulation, and you see progesterone rising and falling afterwards. So the hormonal changes are very, very similar, if not identical. What's different is what's happening in the uterus. So you still have the increase in the depth of the uterine lining, but when fertilization does not happen, instead of the lining just going back to the way it was without any obvious external signs, there's a very obvious time when the uterine lining is sloughed off. So the uterine lining is a bunch of cells and a bunch of small blood vessels, and all of this is shed if ovulation doesn't happen, which means that there's a very noticeable bloody discharge that we call menstruation. There are various ideas about why this happens, and perhaps we'll talk about it a little bit in class. There was a paper that you could have read as part of your reproduction read-write assignment that talks about this in a bit more detail. But suffice it to say, the names of the two kinds of cycles relate to the major differences between the two. In the menstrual cycle, the most obvious sign is this blood flow that occurs at the end of the cycle, while in the estrous cycle, the most obvious sign that occurs is a change in behavior when females are sexually receptive. So the estrous cycle refers to that change in behavior because there's no obvious other external signs like menstruation.